Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Harvest is in the home stretch and glad you could be here with us for our last show of October. We've got a good one in store for you. We are kicking things off with the weather, and we got an early glimpse of Old Man Winter with the cold and snow definitely causing some disruptions earlier this week. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh spoke with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher to get some insight on what producers can expect for this winter and how agriculture might be affected.
As we've seen in the past few weeks, the temperatures have been a mix of both high and low with varying amounts of precipitation. Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher says this is actually a positive weather pattern, but overall we need more.
The problem is we're not getting enough of them, and most of these have been moving to the east as we've been dealing with that ridging pattern. And that's simply because we're under a La Nina influence, and it's a very common pattern. I've talked to people during the last winter when I thought this event was going to materialize. I said probably expect a dry, warmer harvest period. We've been fairly close to that prediction. But when it does break down and we get these stormy periods, of course, you're going to get these bitter Arctic influences. And the biggest issue going forward is how long will that ridge remain in place and how much Arctic air will we get into our region? And I think that's going to be our big unknown solution. As the upper air low in the eastern Aleutian Islands starts to work its way eastward, during the second half of the winter is what I suspect will happen. It'll start to push that ridge to the east. That'll allow more energy to come into the northwestern United States, and most likely we'll see some more of that energy dig down into the central Rockies, and we'll start to see a more normalized winter pattern. We don't have any subsoil moisture to speak of, and we're going to have to rebuild that. So even though we're getting these big precipitation events, or it looks like we're getting big precipitation events, remember, it's the liquid equivalent moisture that we're worried about, and there's really not a lot of room to catch up. To catch up now from what we missed from this fall is going to require a pretty nasty winter.
The wildfires out west have had an impact on Midwest weather as well, but Al says the end of November should bring some relief.
I think that we've seen most of our major impacts. You know, a lot of it's been the low level and mid level and high level smoke that's been coming over. You know, we've had days where at high level we blocked the sun during the last hour or two of the evening and in the first hour or two of the morning. Western Nebraska's had more closer to those big fires in Colorado and Wyoming. They have to deal with a lot more lower level smoke. It's west of the Continental Divide where there's less snow, and this system here is really pushing most of it on the east of the Continental Divide. Until we get a big storm system coming into central northern California and dumping copious amounts of rainfall all the way through the Great Basin into western Colorado, we're likely to deal with wildfire issues all the way into probably the end of November. So as long as we get occasional storm that we can dump 2 or 3 inches of moisture in across a broad area, that'll put things out. But until then, we're probably going to see continuation of these major wildfires, particularly the closer you get to the Pacific Ocean.
While this winter looks to have some moisture, Al says we need more frequent events in order to preserve the topsoil, and the northern snowpack could be a major predictor.
We need to see some regularity to these events so that we can feel comfortable that as we go through the tail half of the winter and start getting to the spring season, that we would expect those events to continue and bring up more Gulf moisture into our region as the air temperatures start to warm. The western half of the state is going to be really dictated by snowpack. We not only need to see a normal snowpack, we need to see it much above normal. If we do not have snowfall at the lower elevations like we did last winter, it was all up high, then when we melt, we lose some of that in the lower elevations to infiltration. It doesn't get into the stream flows. And the biggest issue in whether or not that is going to happen, and there's high evidence of this, and NOAA's done a good research on this, snow impacts during La Nina years, is to watch the Dakotas and southern Canada. If we develop a big snowpack there as we go into late November and early December, the most likely scenario is that's going to reinforce Arctic air surges and make it more intense. And those are what we would be more concerned about. So I see that as our major issue going forward. So that snowpack is going to be key. If it doesn't develop, the odds are that we will have a more benign winter. But if that snowpack develops up there, and there's signs of it with these last storm systems, then likely we're going to have a really rough first half of the winter.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. We'll check in with Al at the end of the show for his weekly weather forecast. Make sure you stick around for that. Time for markets now, and according to the USDA's latest crop progress report, corn is more than 3/4 harvested, while soybean harvest is nearly complete. All of this on the heels of corn and soybean prices that continue to see lots of optimism for those producers. Darin Fessler of Lakefront Futures and Options joined me this week to talk about all that and more. But I began our interview by getting an idea of how our recent bout of snow and cold weather has impacted the market.
Yeah, far from a corn and bean standpoint, I don't know if it's going to have a major implication on harvest progress at all. Harvest progress in general across the state of Nebraska has been going pretty good. More or less because we haven't had a lot of rain. Knock on wood, we kind of need some of that. But I take a look at, how much this corn has really dried down in certain locations, and then other locations, say you're out kind of central Nebraska, whether it be the clouds, maybe some of the smoke from the fires, but some of that corn's kind of stopped drying down a little bit. So that's a little bit of a concern for some guys out there. But in general, I don't think the recent snows are going to have that much of an impact here.
Darin, we've talked on the show the last couple weeks about the rally with corn and soybeans. Are producers still seeing lots of optimism with this?
Oh, for sure. And like they probably should at this point. You look at where we've come basically from those August 10th lows to where we are now. And, I don't think anybody in their wildest imagination could have seen this type of resurgence. Because I will say with clients across the country, the yields, they're okay. They're not great, but they're not a disaster. But there's a lot of variability in this corn crop. And you take a look at how the spreads have reacted on corn and in the beans, even the basis levels on corn, it's telling producers exactly what they need to know right now and what to do. The demand is strong, the basis is strong, and I think there's multiple things. The demand is there, and the crop may not be there. I think it's there to a certain point. We're probably not down to a 1.2 or 1.3 billion carryout on the corn, but we are significantly under a 2 billion, I think, at the end of the day. Now, whether the USDA recognizes that in the November WASDE, I think only time will tell. But the way the spreads of bases are trading, I think we're probably somewhere 1.6, 1.7 billion carryout instead of a 2.2 on corn. And if you look at the bean side of things, the pace that we are on, just looking at the sales, if we stay on the same pace, we're going to outpace the USDA export projections by over 630 million bushels. We'll be out of beans by then, and that's not sustainable.
So what are some things producers can do to take advantage of these higher prices?
Well, like I said with the spreads, the market's telling you they want the bushels now, and I really encourage producers to take advantage of the bushels, because if you plan on rolling from, say, on the beans, November to Jan, you're actually rolling into an inverse. You don't want to do that. You're probably going to pay a roll fee as well. Take it, look for a pullback. But if you look for a pullback here, re-own the board. I still think there's some situations that could play themselves out in the producer's favor in Argentina and Brazil. The dryness, especially in southern Brazil, is not going away. I don't think tomorrow. So I think there's still going to be opportunities for the upside. If you look on a technical perspective on November beans here, as long as we get a close above 1082.5 on the continuous charts, it could, not saying it will, but it could go to $11.30 to $12 if you run into some weather issues in South America, because you pushed off the bean crop to a certain point where you're going to really hurt the safrinha corn crop. Corn again could continue to on his bullish trend as well. So anything above 420, you could be looking at 440, 450. But then you start wondering, okay, when do the back months like these 21, November 21, when do they have to start participating? Because if we are significantly low on the bean side of things, you look at Nov 21, boy, that would be significantly undervalued in my estimation.
And then what about some things farmers can do to protect themselves? Seems like there's always instability out there that turns things in the other direction. So you need to keep your eye on the markets, but also any outside influences, right?
You absolutely do. I think we're at levels on both the corn and the bean market. You step in, you reward it. If you think it's going higher, just simply buy some protection, buy some insurance underneath this market to give yourself somewhat of a floor. Don't be overly aggressive with futures right now, especially on the bean side of things. That's what I continue to advise clients, because this thing could really ramp higher here, because it really has that fundamental story, has the technical story too. The corn side of things, Grant, if you look at the payments that we'll have from the PLC and some of the other government payments, we're at levels where just rewarded with some cash sales. I think that if you're up that 50 to 75% sold in the corn at this point, I think those are good levels. Keep in mind, if the spreads continue to act as they are, there's really not a good reason to hold corn past March of next year. But if it does, can dryness conditions linger on, hey, re-own it on paper. That's still an option for producers.
And Darin, before we let you go, another big thing that we're watching, less than a week away now from the presidential election. Investors, of course, paying attention to the stock market during an event like this. But does history tell us we can expect volatility or any surprises in the ag markets?
Well, there's been studies out there revolving around the equity markets leading up 90 days, 60, 30 days leading up to the election, and how does the stock market performance and how does that pan out for the incumbent candidate? And it bodes well for the incumbent candidate. Now, the impact on the agricultural side of things, I think you got to look at maybe the other side of the aisle and saying, okay, what ramifications and what relationships has say Biden had with China, and how does that move going forward? Because if I look at the list here, China's number one on corn sales right now, number one on beans, number one on pork. China's buying a lot here. So how does a Trump reelection, how does that impact the relationship with China moving forward, or vice versa with Biden? I think you got to look at the trend as your friend, follow the technicals, and watch what China does, not what China says. And I think that's going to be the leading indicator of where a lot of these commodities go, regardless of who's elected.
Next week, we'll be joined by Josh Maples for a check on the cattle markets. And speaking of cattle, caring for them in and of itself is hard work. Add in cold weather to that, and you've got a whole new set of challenges. Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with Nebraska Extension educator Steve Niemeyer to learn what cattle producers should be thinking about as we transition into the colder months.
Winter weather is beginning to bear down on producers in the Midwest. Colder temperatures and snow-covered pastures are becoming less accommodating for livestock by the day. On the bright side, there are a plethora of management practices that can go a long way in helping your herd maintain their health and productivity during these cold days. The first thing you need to concern yourself with are the bare necessities. The three main necessities of any grazing operation hinge on water, fencing, and feed. And of course, the need for feed will vary from one operation to another.
Later in the winter and the fall, we'll go back to corn stalks or some other after grass, things like that. And now there's going to be more, they'll have to be purchasing their feed for the winter and that kind of stuff. But then there's also we're using more forages interseeding into the crop ground. So when the corn's out, they can come in with some turnips and radishes, things like that. We also have some that we just planted straight crop without going into it, corn stubble and stuff like that. So that's kind of some of our fall feeding. Everyone is a little different on their operation, on how they do it with the beef cattle. When you have purebred cattle compared to commercial cows, there's a little different scenarios sometimes on their operations and stuff.
Another aspect to consider is water. This is, without a doubt, the most essential aspect to take into consideration. Low temperatures can have a negative effect on many water delivery methods. However, while having free-flowing water would be good, being able to deliver warm water is even better.
The ideal is that they always do better and convert better if you got warm water. A lot of times we're on ponds. In the old days, you had to chop ice and stuff. Some places we have free-flowing wells, like in the sandhills, so that's handy. We have a free-flowing well on our place that it's never stopped for 56 years since it was put in. Just a couple times when in the summer with the pivots now and stuff like that, and that's along the Cedar River. But they're kind of handy when you don't have to chop ice and stuff. But there's newer machines, newer tanks and stuff like that with heated water and stuff like that. So water is a big important item, for livestock.
When it comes to keeping the herd contained, there are a number of fencing options at your disposal. Again, this is one aspect that you'll want to have tailored to your specific needs.
Well, there's a couple things that you might want to be thinking. You know, these will be temporary fences. Usually that'll be going on your other crop ground and stuff. Like with the CRPs, you know, there's a lot of fences and a lot of water systems that aren't used anymore, especially up in the sandhills where there was a lot of irrigated corn that was, the grass was broke up years back, and now they're back to CRP. So some of that infrastructure stuff's not there as easy. So you got to be looking at different fences, different types of things like that, of what to be using, for it. Nowadays, the fences, electric fences are a lot better, more powerful. You got high tensile fencing, you got pivot fences. You can go up through and make your pivot with electric fence on it so you can move it for your, grazing systems, if that works for you. There's different options and stuff like that. So that fencing and water is a big thing when we're trying to move cattle.
All of these considerations are for naught, however, if you have nowhere to feed your herd. When it comes to leasing ground and care of livestock, it's highly recommended to hammer out all details of any lease agreement in writing.
So it's better to have it written down, for both sides of the parties to understand exactly who's responsible for what, from the prices to when they got to leave, who controls, if they have to feed extras. There's all kinds of questions that could be done ahead of time. Renting land, if it's pasture, corn ground, or about anything, but especially with livestock, you're looking at the length of time of grazing that's available for you, especially going into the winter, the stocking rate that you can use on your acres, the fences naturally, water quality, and the amount of corn left in the field. So that's a big thing right now. Nowadays there's a lot better machines. They don't leave as much corn on the ground unless it's a windstorm like we had south of Lincoln. We had like 70-mile-an-hour winds the other day south of Lincoln. So some of our corn went down. Hopefully we got a good machines to pick it up and stuff, but it might take a little bit longer. So those are some of the things that you can use. We have a good program through the Extension Office. Is one of the tools is Corn Stock Grazing Calculator. So it works where you can put your yields down, and then it kind of helps you in your amount of cattle, and it tells you how many days you can be on that field and stuff. Nowadays you always hear how poor the quality of the stocks are for cattle. Really, we don't want to be eating the stocks themselves anyway. They should be moved before then, on that type of thing. So,
fluctuating hot and cold temperatures can have a drastic impact on any animal. So it's best to get ahead of the cold weather before it sets in for the long haul. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. For more information on fall grazing and winter preparedness, head over to beef.unl.edu. Next week, we'll continue this series by telling you some things dairy producers can do to prepare for the colder months. Next up, 2020 has been drier than normal across Nebraska, with every county in the state having some level of drought at some point this year. And those weather conditions must be taken into account when applying nitrogen to fields after harvest. Drier fields may limit things like nitrogen movement in the soil, crop nitrogen uptake, and even yield. I spoke with Extension Nutrient Management and Water Quality Specialist Javed Iqbal about the ways a producer's fertilizer management could change for next year.
Dry year of 2020 might have led to limited movement of nitrogen in the soil profile, less crop nitrogen uptake, and less crop yield, particularly for rain-fed crops. So this means that because of this dry year and limited movement of nitrogen in the soil profile, there are chances that there is more nitrogen remaining in the soil after the crop harvest. So the producers can credit this residual nitrate nitrogen for their next year's fertilizer nitrogen rate for the next year's crop. In this way, they can not only put less nitrogen, but they can save money for next year's crop.
And is there a way that producers can calculate how much residual nitrogen they still have in their soil?
To calculate residual nitrate nitrogen in the soil profile, the producers or the cooperators, they can take a soil sample at 2 to 3 foot depth, and they can send that to a soil testing lab. So once they know how much nitrogen they have in their soil profile, they can put that into equation for determining nitrogen rate for their crop.
And could you give us some reminders when it comes to Fertilizer-N application timing?
Yes, timing of fertilizer nitrogen is really critical, not only to improve crop nitrogen use efficiency, but also improve crop yield, increase profits while protecting our environment. So if you are, for example, if you want to apply nitrogen in fall, there are chances for losing nitrogen, especially when we get heavy precipitation events during winter or spring. So actually matching crop nutrient needs with the nutrient supply is a good option. For example, soil sampling during spring and then split nitrogen application as pre-plant or in season is really a good practice for maximizing nitrogen use efficiency, maximizing crop yield and profits.
And if producers are going to apply fertilizer nitrogen in the fall, what are some factors that they should consider?
Right. So yes, if the producers want to apply fertilizer during the fall, there are some factors that they may consider. For example, they want to apply fertilizer when the temperature is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit at 4-inch soil depth, and the temperature is going towards more cooler conditions. And also there is one thing to consider, that producers may want to limit their nitrogen application to fine textured soils compared to coarse textured soils, because coarse textured soils tends to not hold nitrogen for your next year's crop. And also, if you want to apply nitrogen fertilizer as commercial nitrogen this fall, you may want to consider anhydrous ammonia than any other fertilizer. Also, you may consider applying part of the nitrogen fertilizer during this fall, while the remaining nitrogen can be applied in season for next year's crop.
Okay, and we've had you on the show before, and you've told us about the 4 R's of fertilizer management. So could you give our viewers a reminder of what those are and why they're important?
Right. 4 R's of nutrient management, it is a nutrient management and water stewardship approach, which focuses on the right source, right rate, right time, and right placement of fertilizers. So 4 R's, if you're following the 4 R's, that means that you are kind of matching nutrient supply with the crop nutrient requirement. So overall, 4R management practices can help to maximize nitrogen use efficiency, maximize crop yield, increase profits while protecting the environment.
We've got more information on the Market Journal website about ways to manage your fertilizer application following a dry 2020. We'll end today's show by bringing back Al Dutcher for a preview of this week's forecast. Al, we had us a late October snowfall earlier this week. How are things looking as we head into November?
Well, Troy, we certainly had to have that snow. It was a big one out in western Nebraska. We had anywhere from 7 to 10 inches general coverage, with some isolated spots reporting a little over 12 inches. And much more significant snowfall up to the northwest of there on the front slopes of the Rockies in Montana, and then of course the bigger snows in the Colorado Rockies. Following that was some bitter cold temperatures anywhere from 25 to 50 degrees below average for much of the northern plains all the way through the Texas Panhandle. And of course we started to see some relief from those temperatures as the week progressed. We had a little wave move through the upper plains on Thursday. It brought us a little cool down, and we've seen some nice weather the last couple days. Got yet another cold front that's going to move through the state during this weekend. And then it looks like a very nice stretch of weather at least through the end of next week before we start to turn our attention to a major storm system that looks like it's going to redevelop once again over the northern Rockies and probably will impact the northern plains and potentially Nebraska. So let's get to the upper air models and see what we have in store. And as we go to the upper air models, here's a trough that's going to be responsible for bringing a cold front through the state today. It can be a little chillier this afternoon across the northern part of the state, and that will gradually fill in toward the south. Very cool for the Halloween trick-or-treaters, and a little bit windy, but high pressure will be firmly in control. And that will move further southward as the overnight hours progress, and we'll be on the back side of that low as we go into tomorrow. So we can see that cold air starting to lift toward the east, so we'll keep a little coolness here in eastern Nebraska, a little bit of a warming temperature in western Nebraska, but overall we're still going to be basically the 45, 50 degree mark. And then we see as we go precipitation-wise, all of that hangs to our east. And then we start to see the ridge building on Monday into our region, much warmer temperature. We should add at least about 5 to 10 degrees onto our temperatures under the influence of high pressure, pretty much from coast to almost coast. And that's going to be a very nice trend for the last of the harvest activity. No precipitation in the forecast. Then as we get into Tuesday, we see that ridge broadening out. We see a trough trying to make its way into the western United States, but high pressure firmly in control over the center part of the country. Would not be surprised we'll see a few isolated 70s across western Nebraska, but more likely widespread 60s across much of the remainder of the state with nothing in the way of precipitation. Now, as we get into Wednesday, that trough starts to make it in a little bit closer to the Pacific Northwest. The energy runs up across the northern Rockies. That keeps us basically high and dry. Winds are likely to start to pick up in earnest as we get to the end of the week as that system makes its way closer to the state of Nebraska, but overall precipitation is just not there. By the time we get to Thursday, we start to see that trough making inroads in the Pacific Northwest and the jet stream flying across the northern plains. Low pressure starts to develop across portions of southern Oregon. That's going to start to lift some Pacific moisture into the Pacific Northwest, giving them some real widespread precipitation. And that system will start to dig as we get into Friday. And that low digging down to this coastal region will start to induce a low pressure system basically over the central California, eastern California region, and that will start to bring moisture much farther inland into the northern Rockies in the northwest. And then that system basically will keep dry conditions into our region. As we go farther out in time, though, the 8 to 14 day forecast brings that cold air a little bit closer into the region, pushes the warm air to our east, and in terms of precipitation, we start to see above normal precipitation showing up for the northern Rockies. We need to watch out for this system. The models have been getting stronger and stronger with this, and it's been digging it farther and farther southward. So, especially for the cattle folks, be aware that there is a potential for this to develop into a fairly significant snowstorm across the northern Rockies and eventually make its way into the southern plains and eventually maybe even some snowfall for eastern Nebraska as that cold air settles to the south. So overall, Troy, it looks like a very nice week with potential storm next weekend.
Thanks, Al. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media so you can join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.